I may have to hold you here until we clarify matters. No, this is my garden, my grill. We received a report about someone matching your description, acting suspiciously. What is it that you're doing today? What does it appear I'm doing? I'm preparing supper. Are you going to bother me for that? Sir, please maintain your composure. No, you remain calm. You burst into my property, accusing me of... An elderly African-American gentleman, a World War II veteran, was apprehended by law enforcement officers within his own backyard. This occurred after an officer erroneously claimed he matched a criminal record that did not, in fact, belong to him. This assertion was never substantiated, yet it became the sole justification for detaining a man lawfully present on his own land, engaged in perfectly legal activities. What transpired was not a matter of simple confusion or a miscommunication. Rather, it was a documented breakdown in protocol. This incident transformed a private residential space into the scene of a civil rights infringement and initiated a chain of events that would ultimately cost the municipality millions of dollars. Before we delve any deeper, please share your geographical location in the comments section below and ensure you subscribe, as tomorrow's narrative is one you absolutely will not want to miss. The gentleman at the heart of this unfortunate occurrence was named James Carter. He was 94 years of age, an African-American man, a veteran of the Second World War, and a retired mechanic. He had resided in the same dwelling for many decades. This was not an unfamiliar place to him. It was not a rental property, nor was it a temporary dwelling. It was his own residence, which he had purchased many years prior, paid for in full, and had lived in peacefully ever since. On that particular afternoon, James Carter was in his backyard performing an activity he had engaged in on numerous occasions before. He was operating a small apparatus as part of a controlled task he practiced on his own property. Although it was noisy, it was entirely lawful. The yard was enclosed by a fence. There were no individuals in close proximity. No one was being subjected to any threats. He was not pointing anything towards anyone. He was not situated near the street. He was not attempting to draw any undue attention to himself. He was, in essence, a man simply occupying his own personal space. James had consistently maintained a private existence. His neighbors recognized him as the elder gentleman, a veteran who typically stayed at home, tinkered with tools, and rarely caused any disruption. He possessed no prior criminal history, no previous arrests, no outstanding legal matters, and absolutely nothing in his background that would suggest he posed a danger to anyone. And at that precise moment, he had no reason to anticipate that his afternoon would conclude any differently than any other. This changed abruptly with the arrival of the police. Officer Daniel Reeves was the first responder to the scene. He had been a member of the police force for several years and was on patrol that day. He had been dispatched following a call reporting suspicious noises emanating from a backyard. The initial report did not specify any criminal activity. It did not mention any weapon being aimed at anyone. It did not allude to any violence. The report simply described something that sounded unusual. Upon Reeves's arrival, he did not encounter a man in flight. He did not witness a brawl. He did not observe any scene of disarray. What he found was an elderly African-American gentleman standing on his own property. Instead of treating the situation as a routine inquiry, Reeves quickly concluded that something was amiss. From the outset, the focus was not on the activity itself, but rather on the individual performing it. Reeves later asserted that James Carter appeared suspicious. This suspicion was not rooted in his actions, but rather in the officer's preconceived notion of who Carter might be. The officer conducted a swift background check and informed James that he bore a resemblance to someone with a criminal record. James immediately denied this, stating that it was untrue. He insisted that he had never been arrested and had no criminal past, suggesting there must be an error. The officer, however, did not accept his explanation. It was at this juncture that the connection between the two individuals became starkly apparent. They were not linked by any shared history. They were not connected through any prior interactions. Their sole connection stemmed from a singular assumption. One man believed the other did not belong in the location where he was presently standing, despite all available evidence to the contrary. James explained that the property was his. He elaborated that he had been residing there for many years. He reiterated that he was not the individual the officer was searching for, but the officer remained fixated on the idea that the system had flagged him for a specific reason. Rather than stepping back, the officer intensified his approach. Reeves proceeded as if the purported criminal record were an established fact, despite the absence of any verification. He treated James as if he were being dishonest, notwithstanding the lack of any proof to support this assertion. He interpreted James's denials not as clarification, but as defiance. The officer issued commands, and James complied. The officer posed questions, and James answered them calmly. There was no raised voices, no threats, and no sudden movements. Nevertheless, the officer persisted in acting as if he were dealing with an individual of a dangerous nature. At no point did the officer first attempt to confirm the ownership of the property. At no point did he verify the existence of the record he claimed to possess. At no point did he pause to consider whether the identification match was accurate. What the officer claimed and what was factual were already diverging significantly. James was subsequently detained. An elderly gentleman, a veteran of World War II, was being held in his own backyard based on a criminal record that did not belong to him. This detention was not predicated on any concrete evidence. It occurred because the officer chose to place more trust in his suspicion than in the observable facts before him. The longer the encounter persisted, the more difficult it became for the officer to alter his course of action. Every passing minute amplified the initial error. James remained composed, but the situation itself was far from tranquil. What had begun as a complaint about noise had escalated into a full-blown detention, and once that threshold was crossed, there was no simple path to reconciliation. At this juncture, the reality of the situation was straightforward. James Carter was not a criminal. He was not a wanted individual. He was not violating any laws, yet he was being treated as if none of these facts held any significance. And the ramifications of that decision were only just beginning to unfold. The detention should have concluded swiftly. All the necessary information to exonerate James Carter was readily available. His age did not align with the details on the record. His address did not match the record. His personal history did not correspond with the record. Despite this, none of these discrepancies halted the proceedings that followed. Instead of de-escalating, the situation continued to progress. The officer persisted in treating the criminal record as if it were legitimate, even though it had not undergone any confirmation. The supposed match was at best tenuous, relying solely on a similar name and nothing more. The individual associated with the actual criminal record was decades younger, resided in a different locale, and had no connection whatsoever to the property where James Carter was standing. These discrepancies were not concealed. They were evident. They were simply not acted upon. James repeatedly stated that he had never been arrested. He explained that he had resided in that home for many years. He did not engage in any arguments. He did not raise his voice. He did not disregard any instructions. None of these actions altered the officer's persistent course. At this point, the core issue was no longer about the noise complaint. It was no longer about any alleged infraction. It was no longer about public safety. The encounter had narrowed to a single, crucial question: whether the officer was willing to pause and re-evaluate his assumption. He chose not to. As minutes elapsed, the justification for the detention became increasingly fragile. Each subsequent decision made the previous one more challenging to reverse. The officer interpreted James's calm demeanor not as cooperation, but as an opportunity to further test his resolve. Instead of thoroughly verifying the record, the officer used the very delay as a reason to maintain control. This is how escalation can occur subtly. No shouting, no sudden movements, just a series of choices compounding upon one another. James's advanced age became impossible to overlook. He was 94 years old. His movements were slow, and his speech was clear. Nothing about his presentation suggested urgency or presented any threat. Yet the officer continued to act as if releasing him prematurely would constitute a significant error. The property itself provided a clear narrative. The residence was well maintained. The yard displayed clear indications of long-term habitation. Tools, equipment, and familiar pathways were evident, suggesting a lived-in space, not a temporary occupancy. All these factors pointed towards ownership. Nevertheless, no concerted effort was made to confirm this. The longer the interaction continued, the more the balance of the situation shifted. What had begun as an officer responding to a citizen's report transformed into an officer defending his initial decision. The objective was no longer to ascertain the truth, but rather to justify the necessity of the stop. This is precisely where the system failed James Carter. There were numerous junctures where the situation could have been amicably resolved. A comprehensive identity verification could have been performed. Property ownership records could have been confirmed. Supervisory personnel could have been consulted at an earlier stage. All these options were available. None of them were utilized in a timely manner. Consequently, James remained detained. The officer continued to rely on a criminal record that did not pertain to him. The claim remained in effect even as the factual evidence undermined it. The error was no longer minor. It had become an active detriment. James complied with every directive. He offered no resistance. He did not attempt to flee. He did not try to depart. His cooperation did not expedite the termination of the detention. It merely allowed it to continue unimpeded. What exacerbated the seriousness of the situation was not what James did, but rather what the officer consciously chose not to do. As time progressed, the inherent stress of the moment began to manifest. This was not evident through raised voices or panicked reactions, but rather through prolonged delays. Every minute that James remained detained amplified the gravity of what had already transpired. The officer had crossed a critical boundary, and retreating from that position required an admission of error, an admission that did not come easily. Eventually, additional verification procedures were initiated. Information that should have been reviewed at the outset began to surface. Details that directly contradicted the initial assumption became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The name associated with the criminal record did not align. The age was incorrect. The address was wrong. The personal history was inaccurate. By that point, the detention had already occurred. James had been treated as a suspect on his own property. He had been physically restrained. His freedom had been curtailed based on an unsubstantiated claim that could not withstand scrutiny. The escalation was complete. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It had evolved into a situation where the facts were known, but action was taken far too late. The error had transitioned from a personal judgment to an official action. And once that shift occurred, the repercussions became unavoidable. The truth was closing in, and when it arrived, it would fundamentally alter everything. This transition did not occur with overt drama, nor with loud exclamations or blaring sirens. It happened subtly, as significant errors often do. Initially, nothing appeared to have changed. James Carter was still being detained. The officer remained steadfast in his decision. The scene seemed frozen, as if time itself had decelerated. However, behind the scenes, a process had begun to unfold. The identity check, which had been delayed, was finally completed. Not partially, not loosely, but thoroughly. The name linked to the criminal record was not James Carter. The age did not match. The physical description was dissimilar. The address was incorrect. The individual connected to that record resided in a different state and was over 40 years younger. There was no longer any plausible explanation to reconcile. When this confirmation was received, the atmosphere shifted instantaneously. The officer's demeanor changed. The self-assurance that had guided every previous decision vanished. The certainty was gone. What remained was a profound silence. James Carter was no longer merely a man who denied possessing a criminal record. He was now officially confirmed as having no criminal history whatsoever. No outstanding warrants, no prior arrests, nothing. And this was merely the beginning. As supervisory personnel were notified and the situation was reviewed in real time, additional information emerged. The property on which James was standing was confirmed as his. Public records clearly indicated that he had owned the home for many years. Tax records corroborated this. Utility records also aligned. Everything fell into place. There was no longer any room for doubt. At that point, the detention had absolutely no legal basis upon which to stand. When a supervising officer arrived and reviewed the gathered information, the reaction was immediate. The transformation was palpable, even without a single word being spoken. Faces tightened and brows furrowed. One official stared intently at the screen for an extended period, as if desperately hoping that something had been overlooked. Nothing had been missed. The footage captured by the body camera was replayed. The initial moments of the encounter, the decisions made, the missed opportunities to de-escalate. Each minute was now being viewed through a completely different lens. What had previously appeared as caution now seemed like a deliberate refusal to listen. What had been framed as adherence to procedure now looked like obstinacy. And what had been interpreted as suspicion now appeared as outright bias. Then came the detail that silenced the room. James Carter's military service was confirmed. This was not a recent enlistment, nor a minor role. He had served overseas during World War II, during a period when very few individuals were still alive to recount those experiences. His age, his background, his documented service record, all of it was verified and substantiated. This was not just an innocent man. This was a World War II veteran who had been detained on his own property. The impact of this realization was immediate. One official slowly shook his head. Another leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed together in a thin line. No one spoke. No one needed to. The weight of what had transpired was already unequivocally clear. The officer who had initiated the detention stood apart, no longer speaking with any semblance of authority. He no longer issued commands. His role had shifted without any formal announcement. Control had been relinquished from his hands. James Carter was uncuffed a short while later. There was no apology offered at that precise moment. No explanation was provided that could possibly undo what had already occurred. The release was quiet, almost uncomfortably so. It was the kind of silence that descends when everyone present understands that a significant error has been made. James did not raise his voice. He did not demand explanations. He did not express elation. He simply stood there, awaiting the conclusion of the situation. However, the situation did not truly conclude with the removal of the handcuffs, because by then, this had evolved beyond a mere stop. It was no longer just about a single officer's mistake. The incident had escalated to a point where it could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Supervisors meticulously documented the encounter. Notes were taken. Specific timeframes were logged. Decisions were officially recorded. The footage from the body camera was flagged for further review. This was no longer a casual assessment. It was a formal process. The tone of the interaction had completely changed. James Carter was now being viewed not as a potential suspect, but as a victim of an unlawful detention, and this shift in perception was critically important. Officials understood the narrative presented by the video footage. They understood the implications of the official records, and they understood how the public would perceive the events once this information became public knowledge. An elderly African-American veteran in his own backyard, with a criminal record that never belonged to him. A detention that should have concluded much earlier, but did not. There was no way to reframe this situation. The officer's earlier assertions were now indefensible. The facts had finally caught up, and they unequivocally did not support the decisions that had been made. As the review process continued, the body camera footage revealed specific moments that could not be explained away. There were pauses where necessary checks could have been conducted, opportunities where the detention could have been terminated, yet decisions were still made to proceed. Each of these instances added further weight to the gravity of the situation. What made the incident more egregious was not merely the error itself, but the prolonged duration for which it was permitted to continue after the truth had become readily available. That delay was significant, and every individual in that room was acutely aware of it. James Carter was eventually permitted to return to his home without further incident. The yard where he had been standing was once again simply a backyard, quiet and ordinary. However, nothing about what had transpired was ordinary any longer. The incident had been officially recorded, thoroughly reviewed, and unequivocally confirmed, and now it existed as an official record. The officer involved departed the scene under direct supervision. He was not arrested, nor was he commended. He was simply removed from any position of authority. The supervisor remained at the location for an extended period. The atmosphere was somber. This was not a matter that would be relegated to a forgotten file. This was not a complaint that would simply fade away. Everyone understood that once the truth was publicly known, the subsequent actions would be unavoidable. James Carter had been unjustly detained on his own property based on a record that was not his, despite clear indicators that the identification was incorrect, despite his advanced age, despite his personal history, and despite his distinguished military service. And now, that truth was meticulously documented. The surprising element was no longer simply that the officer had made a mistake. The truly surprising element was that the system had acknowledged it. And once the system acknowledges such an event, the narrative shifts from what occurred on that particular day to what will transpire moving forward. The events that unfolded for James Carter did not remain confidential for long. Once the official review was completed, the city faced a predicament it could not ignore. The video evidence was conclusive. The official records were clear. The detention lacked any legal foundation. And the individual at the center of this incident was not just any resident. He was a 94-year-old veteran of World War II who had been detained in his own backyard. The city's legal department moved with expediency, not because the case was minor, but because it was anything but. From the outset, it was evident that this incident could not be plausibly defended as a mere oversight. Too many factual details had been disregarded. Too many opportunities to halt the proceedings had been overlooked. Too much time had elapsed before the truth was finally accepted. James Carter subsequently filed a lawsuit against the city. The claim was straightforward. He had been wrongfully detained. His rights had been violated. He had been treated as a suspect without any supporting evidence on property he legally owned, based on a criminal record that was never his. The lawsuit sought accountability, not mere sympathy. The requested compensation was set at $10 million. This figure was not selected for its sensationalism. It was intended to reflect the severity of the infringement, the advanced age of the individual involved, and the harm caused by a detention that should never have occurred in the first place. It was intended to acknowledge the failure of judgment, not only on the part of a single officer, but by a system that allowed the situation to persist. Once the lawsuit became a matter of public record, the response from the city underwent a further alteration. City officials issued brief, carefully worded statements. They did not dispute the factual accounts. They did not deny the detention itself. They acknowledged that a review was underway, and confirmed that the incident was subject to an internal investigation. The language employed was precise, and the tone was restrained, but the underlying message was unambiguous. This situation was being treated with utmost seriousness. The officer implicated in the incident was removed from active duty pending the outcome of the investigation. His authority on the streets was suspended. His actions were meticulously evaluated, not in isolation, but as part of a broader pattern of decision-making that occurred throughout that day. No public defense was offered on his behalf. The department also announced a series of corrective measures. Training protocols were subject to review. Protocols for identity verification were reinforced. Supervisors were reminded of their critical responsibility to intervene promptly when uncertainty arises. These modifications were not presented as punitive actions. They were framed as preventative measures. Behind closed doors, the legal proceedings continued. The video footage was subjected to further analysis. Official reports were cross-referenced. Timelines were meticulously aligned. Every instance of delay, every decision made, and every missed opportunity was meticulously documented. The central question was no longer whether an error had been committed, as that was already patently clear. The question now revolved around the ultimate cost of that error. James Carter did not engage in interviews characterized by anger. He did not demand public apologies. He did not position himself before cameras seeking public attention. Those close to him indicated that he desired only one thing: to be left in peace within his home, free from the fear that such an incident could ever be repeated. For him, the lawsuit was not motivated by a desire for retribution, but rather by a need to set the record straight. As the legal proceedings advanced, the city opted to reach a settlement. The $10 million settlement effectively concluded the legal battle, but it did not erase the events that had transpired. The financial compensation acknowledged the city's responsibility. It did not rewrite the events of that day. It did not restore the time James Carter had spent detained in his own yard. This outcome did not alleviate the burden on an individual who had already dedicated a significant portion of his existence to serving his nation. However, it conveyed a crucial point. It firmly established that personal possessions hold value, that conjecture is not a substitute for proof, that the passage of years, past contributions, and dedicated service are not nullified by mere suspicion, and that any overreach of authority incurs tangible repercussions. The officer in question did not resume his duties on the streets. The precinct continued its operations under intense public observation, while James Carter resumed his everyday life. The garden returned to its former tranquility. The implements were still in their accustomed places. The boundary fence continued to delineate the perimeter of his residence from the external environment. Nevertheless, the area now possessed a distinct significance. It was no longer solely a sanctuary of personal space. It represented the locus where an institutional lapse occurred, and where that lapse was ultimately recognized. Narratives of this nature frequently conclude with clamor, with vociferous protest, with exultation. This particular account did not follow that trajectory. It culminated in a reckoning. An elderly gentleman was apprehended without justification. The veracity of the situation became apparent, and the municipality bore the financial consequences for disregarding it when it was most critical. This marks the conclusion of this account. The lessons you glean from it are entirely your own. Should this narrative prompt you to pause and reflect, please disseminate it to others who may benefit from understanding how swiftly circumstances can deteriorate when actualities are disregarded. And if you desire more narratives of this ilk, accounts that illustrate the repercussions of authority being wielded improperly, ensure you subscribe to this channel and remain engaged with us.